Hello and welcome to today's session, What Golf Teaches Me About Boundaries. Your presenter today is Wendy McIntosh from Davaar Consultancy. Dr. Wendy McIntosh has over a 30-year history in nursing, in clinical research and education, mainly in mental health. Dr. McIntosh's specialised area of interest was working with adult survivors of childhood trauma. In 2005, Wendy commenced her own consultancy business, Davaar Consultancy. Wendy's life's work has developed in the area of professional boundaries, and she conducts training at a state, national and international level in this area. Wendy conducts a number of two-day workshops on themes such as tenderness, looking after self to decrease the risk of compassion fatigue, working with clients diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and complex trauma. Wendy offers group and individual professional supervision. She has almost 30 years training in psychodrama, and she likes to bring the experiential learning process into the work she does, including webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today, Wendy, and welcome.
Yes, thanks very much, Brooke, and thanks again to Nurses for the invite. Brooke and I were just discussing the fantastic work that nurses do, both in the professional paid area, but also as volunteers. And it would be great to hear more about those volunteer stories, I think, as part of our professional development as well. So, well, welcome to what I hope is going to be an interesting webinar for folks, even if you don't play golf. Just to put this theme into context, I started playing golf about 8 years of age, so many decades ago in Scotland. So I knew much more about golf than professional boundaries for those formative years of my life. And learning about golf, I learned the rules of the game, how to read the lay of the land and where to position the ball, to choose the correct club for the different shots that I was going to play, always aiming for the end point, which was the red or yellow flag in the hole beyond. And learning to appreciate that there were many different routes that I could take to reach that red flag. For many years, golf has been absent in my life due to work commitments and other life choices that I made. I always missed the game because I grew up with the game. And in fact, building my life's work around professional boundaries was one of the areas that took me away from a game I really love. 2 years ago, I started to build the game back into my life. And playing regular games again, I started to realise that there was much in the game that resonated with me about the work I was doing with professional boundaries. So here I am integrating two of my passions into this webinar. And look, I trust that even if you're not a golfer, but maybe you play another sport, or you've got other interests, you sing in a choir, you do gardening. I really think that some of the themes that I bring forward in this webinar will resonate with you in different ways about the parallel processes that can be there for us in our personal and our professional life when it comes to boundaries. So just to let you in on the objectives, let me see how I go here. There we go. So throughout the course of this webinar, I'm hoping that you'll gain an understanding of the importance of context, the context in which you work, to recognise your own red flags or the warning signs that you're about to or have already transgressed a boundary, or perhaps a colleague or a peer has, to explore and examine the reasons for boundary transgressions. Now, they are many and multi-layered, but I'll try and break it down just as I have to break down a game of golf. and to review the professional boundary strategies that you currently use, and that maybe from this webinar you can add other strategies into your practice. So enjoy the game. When I'm warming up to going out for a game of golf, I really start to focus on that game as I'm getting my clubs ready, as I'm putting my clubs into the car, the right attire clothing wise for the game that I'm about to play. Make sure that I've got enough golf balls, because I do lose a lot in every round that I play. So really starting to prepare and focus and imagine the game ahead of me is really important. And I've learned that this is also important in preparing for work as a strategy to help maintain boundaries. So when I'm getting ready to head out to work, as I put on each item of clothing, whether that's a uniform or not, getting my pens ready, watch ready, name badge. I think for all of us, just to start warming up to what's required for me for the next few hours I'm going to be at work. So that means my patients are going to be dependent on me, my colleagues are going to be dependent on me. So what do I need to do in order to be able to give as fully as I can when I'm there? So taking time to prepare our body, our minds and our emotions for the work ahead. Really important, that preparation and warm up. And part of that, I really believe, is understanding what we have committed to, our regulatory and our organisational requirements, our professional codes. If I'm unclear about a specific requirement in golf, i.e. can I lift this ball and move it? What happens if I hit another player's ball? Then I can go to the rule book to get the answer, or I can talk to my golf partner or the other folks that we're in the game with just to get that clarity. And having come back into the game after several decades, I haven't been as sharp as those rules that I understood as a young player. So I've sought guidance from those people I'm playing with. And trust that the information that they're giving me is correct. But I can also go to the guide and find out for myself. So I think similarly in our professional roles as nurses, it's important that we understand our professional codes, the job descriptions, the policies and the guidelines that are there to guide us. And in the new code of conduct, that was put out by the Nurse and Midwifery Board of Australia last year, there's actually a section in there on professional boundaries, which I believe is a really good guide for all of us in our practice. I think it's just really good to be familiar with and to understand what we're being asked and expected to do from an organisational perspective and also from our regulatory boards. And where we're not clear or something feels, I don't know, like one sentence says one thing and the other says something completely different, then to seek out some clarity around that. I believe the more informed we are, the more effective we'll be in the decisions that we make. So in the professional boundary language, there are a number of definitions that organisations use, that's within the codes that govern this work. And most of the literature about professional boundaries, certainly within a Western context, these are the definitions that you'll see there. So we talk about professional boundary crossings, professional boundary violations, and sexual misconduct. Professional boundary crossings are usually those kind of thoughtless words or actions. So we just say or do something without really thinking about it, and there's no clear intent that we're using the power of our role to get our own needs met with the vulnerability of the clients. And sometimes professional boundary crossings are okay if we've got enough data that says, I did this at this time because I assessed that it was in the best therapeutic benefit for the client. And we have to have really good data to support that. So we can't just say, I felt like this is what I should do. There has to be good data to substantiate that. But the crossing in itself also becomes a bit of a red flag to us, that maybe there's something that needs to be rebalanced within that professional relationship, whether that's in the one-to-one sphere or within the system that you work in. Something needs to be clarified, something needs to be put into the client's notes so that everybody is operating from the same base. And that's really important. Consistency with professional boundaries is really important. It's key. So if we have a team of nurses and let's say there's a group of 6 nurses and 5 out of the 6 operate in a certain way, but one goes off and does something in their own way because they've made an assessment that that's the best thing to do, then we find that's not really useful in terms of the client's care and the client's understanding of the professional relationship and the service that they've been offered. So consistency is really important. And when I'm doing workshops with people, I say, it's okay for us to have discussions in the back room when we disagree with a decision. It's okay to have robust discussions and that we all have a voice to say why we should do a certain intervention or not. We have those discussions and we hold them in the back. But when we're out there in front of the patients and their family or friends, then actually we're presenting a united front. It just decreases the anxiety for patients when they can see that we're all consistent in the practice that we're doing. A professional boundary violation, however, is never okay. I think the word violation is quite a strong word. And when I ask people about what do they think a violation might be, most of them go to what I call the top end, where health professionals assault patients, maybe get money from them, maybe get involved in sexual relationships with them that are not so good. Well, yes, that happens, and that's at the top end of violations. That's true. However, violations happens along a spectrum, and I'll present that a bit more later on. And it can actually start with perhaps a hand on the shoulder. That isn't actually required, but that hand on the shoulder becomes a daily occurrence. And I do a lot of body work with people during the workshops, so try and understand what your body is saying and doing and understand the message that's in there and the covert or overt messages that could be translated in touch. So we have to look at the patterns of behaviour and see if what we're doing could actually fit into that violation kind of frame. So it starts with a hand on the shoulder that becomes a regular pattern of behaviour, and that can lead to much more ingrained behaviours which take people close to or into the illegal end of the framework. As I say, I'll explain that later. There are 4 categories of concern that we also look at within the context of the professional boundary language. They are the professional role. So what is the role I'm actually being paid to do versus what is the role that I want to do? Am I at risk of engaging in a dual or multiple relationship with the patient. Now, in small, rural, remote areas, the risk of boundary transgressions increases significantly because health professionals, teachers, police officers are very much a part of their community. So while they're providing the professional service, their kids might also be at the same school, or they go to the same church, or they go to the same footy team. So they have to be really clear about what role they're in and have really clear discussions with folks about, when I'm at the footy, I'm not going to discuss anything to do with your medical care. When we're at our kids' music concert, I'm not going to talk to you about your time in hospital. So we just have to be really clear, working in rural and remote areas. What hat am I wearing? What role am I in at the time? Another category of concern that we need to be aware of is that of access to and disclosure of information. So how much information do I need to disclose about myself in order that it has therapeutic value for the client? And that will very much depend on the context in which we work, our job description, etc. So again, being really clear, what am I being asked to do here versus what do I want to do? So disclosing information about ourselves, but also how much information do I need to access about the client in order to do the job that I'm being paid to do, as opposed to how much information do I need to access about the client because this is something that really interests me, or there's something in their story that resonates with me, so I want to find out more about them. And the last category of concern that we need to consider is that of giving and receiving gifts, money, and different services. So services means things like hairdressing, car maintenance, flowers. So we use the connections that the client and or their family has with those services that perhaps we could get at a reduced rate or for free. So we need to be very careful again to keep us out of the conversation and only have our professional self there. One definition that I don't have in there, which is also really important for us to understand about professional boundaries, and again, this is very much a Western construct. And this is the most common definition that you'll find in the literature around professional boundaries, that it's the limits that protect the space between the professional's power and the client's vulnerability. In some texts, you'll see it written up as protect the space between the client's vulnerability and the professional's power. However, they're both, they both say the same things. We're in powerful positions as service providers. Clients are in vulnerable positions because they're service recipients. And so we need to at all time be very careful of what we're saying and doing, and to be reflective of what we're saying and doing. And those limits are there to create a buffer zone, an area that protects who I am personally and that relationship between the personal and the professional and the client. One of the things that I learned very early in playing golf, that I had to be really considerate of which club I was going to choose. So only certain clubs can be used on the green. This kind of club means I'll get a much, much more height. This club means I'll get much more distance. Well, that's how it's meant to play. And I guess in interventions with our clients, it's really important that we consider what we're about to say and do next. What is the most appropriate thing to say and do here? And just like I'm choosing my club for the next shot I want to play, I have to take some time when I'm with clients to go, Okay, that's really interesting what they're bringing forward. I just need to sit on that for a couple of seconds rather than react and jump in right away. Just sit back, reflect, and then be really thoughtful about what I say or do next. And the tone of voice I've learned in professional boundaries is really important to when we're setting limits and when we're maintaining limits on those professional boundary relationships. The tone of voice becomes very, very important. We must always be respectful and dignified in the requests that we ask, in the directions that we give, in the conversations that we have. And again, back to the use of touch. And as nurses, we touch a lot, and we're given, different permissions to do that. But touch is very important for many different reasons. And for many clients, touch may have been used inappropriately to them in the past. And so I think it's always really careful that if we don't really know the person's story, and maybe it doesn't really matter if we know the person's story, but to recognise that because we touch in a certain way, that might be misread, or that might really harm people, but they can't actually say no, or they can't tell us not to touch because we're in that powerful role. So even the use of touch, I think, is really important. Touching, if we have to take a person's pulse and we have to touch their wrist, to really say, this is what I'm going to do. So every time we go to touch the skin, touch the body, touch the person, to really be clear with them about what we're doing and seek their permission where possible. In golf, as in work, there have been many times where I've incorrectly chosen a club or I've hurried a shot and the outcome's not been so good. Similarly, I've found that if I rush an intervention or I don't take time to consider the response I'm going to give, that professional relationship really stumbles. And what has been important for me is to reflect, to be really curious about the club or the intervention that I've used. And where I can, to say to myself, just stop here for a little moment, just breathe, take some time before I hit the next shot, take some time before I say or do the next step in the professional relationship. I have definitely found over the years that golf is a much easier game to play if I stay on the fairways. When I hit that little white ball into the trees or into the bunker. Now, for those that don't play golf, the bunker is a very deep hole filled with sand, and no golfer likes to end up in them. Or the water, that's a really good place for me to lose golf balls each time I play. So when I don't hit straight, when I go into those trees or the bunker or the water, it really affects my game. It affects it in all sorts of different ways, puts me off balance a little bit. I get less clear about the club that I have to use, and usually that par 4 could become 10 shots later and it's time to pick up the ball. Well, similarly in that professional relationship, if I don't stick to the professional boundary framework, if I don't really understand my job description or the context in which I'm being employed to work, my regulatory requirements, then it's possible I'll head into the trees and the bunker and the water holes of that professional relationship. And that's where misunderstandings occur. That's where the relationship gets offside. And it's where a lot of issues can emerge in terms of the treatment for the client. So here is the professional boundary framework. I actually really like this framework. I spend quite a bit of time on it on the workshops that I do. So if you can imagine as you look at this model that the professional boundary framework operates along a continuum. Now, in the middle of that is where we want to be, the zone of helpfulness, the therapeutic zone. I also call it the zone of safety. Within that zone, as long as we understand the context in which we've been employed, again, our job description, our regulatory requirements, the policies and the guidelines, as long as we're really clear on that, there's a good chance that we're going to stay within that zone of helpfulness. However, if we step out to become over-involved, or we step out to become under-involved, the closer we get, sorry, I'll change that. The more we move away from the middle bit, the closer we move towards our actions and interventions being viewed through a legal framework, and maybe we move into, I don't know, behaviours that we can be criminally charged for. Now that zone of helpfulness is actually quite a large zone, so there's quite a lot of movement in there. We can be quite creative and spontaneous within that zone as long as we're adhering to those professional and organisational requirements. Now, what I understand in the work that I've been doing is that if we stay in that middle zone, then we can never actually be professionally over-involved. What happens when we come out of that zone is we might become personally over-involved. And when we become personally over-involved, the risk is that we then become professionally under-involved. So if we're sticking with what's required in terms of boundary work, we can never actually be over-involved professionally. But we are over-involved personally, which means we also are under-involved professionally. So I think that's a wonderful paradox about this framework. We can actually be over and under-involved at the same time. And you'll see the 4 categories of concern are there as well. So some examples of over-involvement might be, again, we're disclosing information that's not really relevant to the client's care or their progress, but it helps us fill an uncomfortable space of silence. I don't know, perhaps we just really like the relationship with the patient and they seem much nicer than the colleagues that we're working with, so we share more with them than we do with our colleagues. Maybe that moves up that arrow a bit more, and then we start to share our email address or social media. Perhaps we start to contact the patient out of our working role. Perhaps we bring them in little gifts that we don't bring in for any other patient. And then we start to see them in our own time. So the relationship gets really complex, and all sorts of things can unwind from that relationship that's not in the best interest of either the client or the nurse in the long term. It might feel okay, and it might be as experienced as okay in the short term, but long term, in my experience, there's usually negative impact for both people. You'll notice that perhaps that I've been using the word client and patient interchangeably. That's because I know some nurses refer to the folks that they work with as patients and others as clients, so I'm just trying to cover all bases. Under-involvement starts with negative commentary about patients during handover in corridors. That builds up to where we become distant, professionally distant from the client. Maybe even where we avoid the work that we're being asked to do. we're constantly changing the clients that we don't like to try and get the clients that we do like, so that our day is easier. So there's all sorts of ways that we can become over or under involved that fall into that violation spectrum before we even get anywhere near the illegal part of the boundary framework. So understanding the context of the course that I play on is really important. How many holes are there? What's the hazards here? Is there any specific rules of engagement for this course? Time to read the scorecard or any information that's been given to us as players before we play is really important. And understanding the context of the work that we're employed to do, I cannot emphasize enough how important this really is. So I might be employed in an organisation, let's say 5 days a week to be a registered nurse. 4 of those days I work in mental health. 1 of those days I work in an outpatient diabetic clinic. I'm still employed by the same organisation. I'm still operating under the regulatory requirements as a registered nurse. But the context of working in mental health is quite different to the context of working in an outpatient diabetic clinic. And so I'd have to be careful that for that one day, when I'm in the diabetic clinic, I'm not operating as if I'm in the mental health unit. So understand the context that you're working in is really important. I've figured out in golf, as I have in work, that it's very important to be aware that shadows absolutely change the perspective. So I think I've got a nice clear fairway in front of me. The sun goes behind the clouds, and before I know it, there's a whole new game there in front of me. Shadows are not always easy to recognise when we're working, when we're in an intervention with clients. They can creep up on us, they can take over us, and it's not until we're driving home from work and we're starting to process the day and we go, gosh, that was really curious, I didn't really like what happened there, or this is worrying me a little bit. Or in a casual conversation with a colleague, something is triggered in us, and that shadow looms within us or over us. So it's not always easy to spot the shadows at the time, which is why I believe reflective practice and really processing the day that we've just had at the end of the day is really important. So the shadows can be the red flags. So these are just some, and as we're traveling along in this game today, maybe you can write down some more that come up for you. Taking a patient a meal in your own time, accepting an invitation from a patient to attend a party or a funeral. We get a lot of questions about that. And again, this is where context is really important. If your organisation has a clear policy around staff can attend funerals, and that's good, and the policy is clear, and you have permission then to do it. But some organisations say a representative from the organisation will attend if we're invited to do so. So context, again, so important. Disclosing personal information, I spoke about that. Accepting social media contact. And then on the kind of under-involved, avoiding having contact with the patient, negative deflammatory comments. This is a really important one for us to reflect on. And golf is always my wise guide here. I can see the hole in front of me. I think I've chosen the right club. I think my body's in a good space. I've actually kind of visualised that the golf ball has landed on the green and I take an absolutely dreadful shot which means I just take 2 steps forward for the next hit. Well, we have to be aware that we don't get ahead of ourselves with professional boundaries as well. So I think where we start to believe that we're the only one who can make a difference to this individual's life, where we believe that the system has failed and thus I must do more in terms of the work with this patient. I think that's a real red flag. And we talk about the rescuer or the martyr complex. There'll be many reasons why many of us become nurses, and for many of us that'll be about wanting to give care and good care. And then we always have to come back to what's the regulatory requirements to provide a service, to do that with great respect and dignity, adhere to our code of ethics. And anything more that's coming from our need to provide a service to others, we really need to check in with that and make sure that we're not stepping out of that zone of helpfulness. So I always say to people, please read your guidelines around professional boundaries. And as I said earlier on, there are really good lines within our code of conduct around that. Read them, familiarise with them. If you're unclear, then ask people, get some dialogue going in your workplace. I said earlier on there are many reasons for boundary transgressions, and I can usually spend half a day in the workshop just on this. But I want to try and break it down into 4 different levels. Let's start with the intrapsychic. Within us, we are complex human beings, each one of us as individuals in the world. We come into the profession that we've chosen with our own moral compass, our own ideas about right and wrong, our own ethics in terms of what we learned in the schools and the systems that we grew up in, our family of origin. And they're just bubbling away within us all the time. They need to be kept in check when we go to work, and they certainly inform the work that we do. But if any of those personal roles come out into that professional relationship with our patients, then that's where the relationship changes and we start to move out of the professional boundary zone of helpfulness. Now, likewise, each patient that we come across has their own intrapsychic experience. So it's not inconceivable that in an interaction for the nurse and the patient, something is triggered in both of them intrapsychically that triggers a whole old role response. And before we know it, we're not the nurse and the patient, we're the school kid and the teacher, or the mother and the son. And so there's a different role system that comes into play. It happens really quickly in a nanosecond. And so our tone of voice changes, our behaviour changes, and thus the relationship changes. Now, if we can catch that in enough time, and that's our job to do, we're the professionals. If we can catch that in enough time and we kind of alter our body language, change our tone of voice and become the professional again, then we're in with a good chance to really kind of resolve that professional relationship. But if we're on a bit of a roll and we can't stop ourselves, then again, it's not always to know what damage is caused in the short or long term, but something changes in the relationship. Perhaps the patient did trust us but doesn't trust us anymore. So we have to be careful of the role that we're in. So we both come into the relationship with our intrapsychic self, and then we have an interpersonal relationship, which must always be professional at all times. We have to see that relationship within the organisation that we work in, and that will vary if you're private, public, community, remote, rural, metropolitan. But within that organisation will be the the kind of hierarchy of leadership. There'll be the policies and procedures. Within that will be financial and budget considerations, resource consideration. Within that will be state and federal legislation that has to be adhered to within the organisation. Within that will be the multidisciplinary team. So there's a lot of intrapsychic people having interpersonal relationships within the organisational sphere. And then we take that out a bit more to the broader system in which we find ourselves working with the patient. So again, it doesn't matter if we're working in a metropolitan hospital or rural or remote, there are broader systemic influences that affect what we do at work, knowingly or unknowingly. Is this person also, are they under a forensic order? Do they require security people with them? Is the patient school age, so they have to attend school, or teachers come in and work with them? Is Centrelink involved? Aged care resources. So the broader system that comes into play, which covertly or overtly is affecting that relationship that we're in at the time, as well as our own family and the patient's own family. All these factors come into play. So I do invite, when you're in that relationship with your patients and you do or say something and you reflect about it afterwards, remembering that the shadows might not appear until you're driving home or walking home or cycling home or even playing a game of golf. I've found that these 4 questions are really good professional boundary questions. Whose needs are being met? What was the purpose or intent of my actions and speech? What other options were or are available? And what stops me using another option? Now, I find in professional boundary work, there are a minimal of 5 different options to the one that we take, but it is boundless how many options there actually are, multiple. I like to think, for me, that I've got a little kind of woody woodpecker sitting on my shoulder, and that little woody woodpecker is just pecking away at my intrapsychic self in terms of those questions. So I think when we ask the question, whose needs are being met, there's a really good chance that all of us, most of the time, will absolutely say, I did that for the patient. Absolutely, unquestionable. So then little Woody Woodpecker has to come along and chip away and go, really, tell me a bit more about that. You reached forward for the client. You broke the silent first. What else? Chip, 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 chip away. And if we can really be honest with ourselves, we can get to a position we say, well, actually, yeah, I did that because I really wanted to do something different, or I did that because I thought it would make a huge difference. I feel. These are all clues that that's about us and that we've stepped into that buffer zone and we need to step back out so the buffer zone's still there. It's not always easy to chip away at those questions to get to the real intent and purpose of our actions. However, I've found in the work that I've done with people over the years that when they can truly discern what was about them and what was about the patient, they become much clearer in their role response. The professional boundaries be much clearer. And what many of them say to me post the workshops, and they've put strategies in place, is that they can actually go to work and really enjoy being at work. And they're not taking work home as often as they were. So they're able to process things much quicker. So those 4 questions, I believe, are a really important part of the strategies in terms of professional boundaries. So what are they? Well, when there's a long course ahead that I have to play, I need to ensure I've got enough water, good egg sandwiches and bits of chocolate. I need to ensure that I'm healthy enough to go on to the course to play. I need to, in my warm-up exercises at the beginning, make sure that the joints that are maybe a bit stiff when I get up are a bit more lubricated to play. It's the same thing in terms of going to work. Boundary transgressions can occur when we're not at our kind of most optimal best. And I'm not talking about 100%. I'm talking about being able to go to work and do the job that we're being paid to do. But that requires us to be able to look after ourselves and to ensure that we are well enough to go to work that day, physically, psychologically, emotionally. I have found, just as playing golf, that it is really important to stop, to reflect on what's happening and what the next step will be. There are times where, as nurses, we have to respond in a reactive kind of way, and I get that. This is more about those instances where we don't have to react, but we're in a relationship, and what we're saying or doing can completely change that relationship without us even recognising it. So where we can, just take some time to talk about, have a little internal dialogue. And I should say, and maybe I should have said this earlier on, that I've been talking about our professional relationship with clients and patients, and that's utmost. However, I think a lot of this professional boundary stuff is also really important, working with colleagues as well. And a lot of the principles that we use in that kind of professional client relationship, I think are easily transferable into that collegial relationship. There is no doubt that seeking counsel from a colleague, a supervisor, or a trusted other is really important. And remembering that, if you're a union member, the union's there. There are so many professional bodies available to nurses now that we can get in touch with them and ask lots of different questions. As I said earlier on, having come back into golf after many decades, I find that I turn a lot to the people that I'm playing with now to check in. Has anything changed? What's changed? What do I need to do here? And one of the big ones was we always had to remove the flag when players were putting out when they were on the green, and that's no longer a requirement. So sometimes those changes are really obvious. I get that, we don't need to take the flag out, but sometimes the changes are really subtle, and so it's good to check in. And I think in those professional relationships that we have with clients, as in golf, we have to be open to the game taking us in a completely different course. We can never know for sure the impact that what we say and do will have on another person. I mean, I think sometimes if we've got a reasonable amount of emotional intelligence, we can spot a change in a person's body that might alert us that there's something here to pay attention to. But we never quite know where that journey in that professional relationship will take us. So I think it's being open to that, not just having one course of action, but having options available to us. And again, when we're in a team, that we're all aware of those options, so we don't just have one kind of rogue person going off on their own, changing the rules, changing the context because it suits their purpose, not because it's been a decision that's been made. So really open to any questions that folks have, and because I've really enjoyed putting this together. I'm thinking, oh well, one strategy for me is always to have a bit of a I don't know, a memory jolt about what I'm doing. So I've actually created a T-shirt or a polo shirt for myself. What golf teaches me about professional boundaries. So this is what I wear on the golf course to just remind me of my golf and my professional boundaries. So really happy to have any questions. Brooke, I've
Thank
said
you,
my bit.
Wendy. I love your shirt, Wendy.
So, hi, folks. I've just heard from Brooke, and she's been having difficulty with her sound. So, her advice is that we just kind of stop the webinar now. But look, I think if you've got any questions that I might be able to answer, maybe, I don't know, send an email to Brooke or something, and she could send them on to me, and I'll respond. Otherwise, send me an email at wendy@davaar.com.au. So really happy to assist as I can.